So we're diving into one of the most incredible and honestly one of the most tragic stories in the entire history of science. It's a story about pure genius, deep friendship, and the chaotic human drama that sparked the birth of artificial intelligence.
And I want you to really think about that question, because it's not a hypothetical. It's the true story of Walter Pitts, a man whose mind literally laid the foundation for the AI that powers our world today, and he did it all before he even had a steady place to call home.
Okay, so to really get what Pitts accomplished, you got to understand this huge debate that was raging in the early days of AI. You had two main camps. On one side were the symbolists. They thought intelligence was a top-down thing, all about pure logic and manipulating symbols. But on the other side, you had the connectionists, and they had a totally different idea, a bottom-up approach. They believed intelligence could just emerge from a whole network of simple, brain-like parts. And Walter Pitts, he would become the father of that second idea.
And his journey to get there was, well, it was nothing short of astonishing. This wasn't a story that started in some fancy university lab. It started on the streets.
I mean, the speed of his early life is just mind-boggling. Picture this, at just 12 years old, he's not just reading but finding and correcting errors in one of the most difficult books on logic ever written, Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica. By 15, facing pressure to drop out of school and go to work, he just runs away from home, never sees his family again. And then, at only 17, he stumbles into a meeting with the man who would change his life and the world forever.
And look, this wasn't just some random person saying this. This is a quote from Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics, one of the absolute giants of 20th century science. He recognized immediately that Pitts had a kind of raw, untamed genius he'd never seen before.
And that genius found its perfect match in an older, more established scientist named Warren McCulloch. The two of them were about to team up to try and solve the biggest puzzle of all, the human mind itself.
These two guys could not have been more different. You have Pitts, this young, runaway prodigy, completely self-taught, living and breathing pure logic. And then you have McCulloch, a 42-year-old professor from a wealthy background who was an expert in the messy, biological world of the brain. They came from totally opposite universes, but they were united by one powerful obsession.
They were both completely hooked on this very old idea from the philosopher Leibniz that human thought wasn't some kind of magic, that it was a type of calculation. McCulloch was convinced the brain was the machine doing the calculating, but he had no idea how to prove it with math. And that's where Walter Pitts came in.
So what they built together, it wasn't just a theory. It was the very first mathematical model of a brain, the actual blueprint for every single neural network that exists today.
They called it the McCulloch-Pitts neuron, or MP neuron for short, and the idea was totally radical for its time. They asked, what if a brain cell, a neuron, isn't some complex, goopy biological thing? What if it can be described with simple binary logic, like an on-off switch?
The way it works is just beautiful in its simplicity. So a neuron gets a bunch of input signals. Each of those inputs has a weight, basically how important it is. The neuron just adds up all those weighted inputs, and if the grand total hits a certain target, a threshold, boom, it fires off its own signal. That's it. An incredibly elegant system built from the simplest possible parts. But okay, there was one big problem. Real brains have neurons that are connected in loops. To McCulloch, this seemed like a logical paradox. It was like a conclusion causing its own premise. It didn't make sense. But Pitts saw it completely differently. He realized these loops weren't a bug in the system, they were a crucial feature. They were how the brain holds on to an idea, creating what he so beautifully called an impression stripped of time. In other words, he realized he was looking at the mechanism of memory. So the conclusions from their paper in 1943 were, honestly, they were world-changing. They were making the case that the brain is a computer, a Turing-complete device that can, in principle, compute anything a computer can. That meant every single thought, every idea, could be described with formal logic. That human thought wasn't some mystical, spiritual thing, it was mechanical. In essence, they had taken the soul out of the machine.
And Pitts was suddenly on top of the world. He was at MIT, working with the greatest scientists of his generation. But the very human messiness that he had so elegantly tried to remove from his model of the brain was about to come back and absolutely destroy his life. By 1954, you can see just how high he'd climbed. Fortune magazine names him one of the most talented young scientists in America, on a list with people who'd become absolute legends. This should have been the launching pad for an even greater career, but instead, it was the absolute peak, right before a catastrophic fall.
And the trigger for this fall wasn't some scientific debate. It was a vicious, ugly personal feud. The wife of Pitts' mentor, Norbert Wiener, hated McCulloch's wife, and to drive a wedge between the two men, she made up a horrible lie, accusing someone in McCulloch's circle of seducing her daughter.
Wiener, who we know suffered from bipolar disorder, believed the lie and just cut off all contact. For Pitts, this was an impossible choice. He had to choose between his mentor and McCulloch, the man who'd become a father figure to him. He sided with McCulloch, and then, in a single, devastating act of defiance and despair, he burned his entire PhD dissertation. Years of groundbreaking work that the world was waiting for. He turned it all to ash.
That act of self-destruction was really the beginning of the end for him. But there was still one more scientific blow to come, one that would shatter the very foundation of his entire worldview.
McCulloch's team, with Pitts, ran an experiment to see what a frog's eye tells a frog's brain. The assumption, based on their model, was that the eye is just a camera. It just sends raw pixels back to the brain, which does all the heavy lifting. But the results were stunning. The frog's eye wasn't passive at all. It was actively processing the world, recognizing things like movement and shapes before any signal ever got to the brain.
You have to understand, for Pitts, this wasn't just a fascinating result. It was a full-blown philosophical crisis. His entire beautiful model was built on the idea that the brain was the one central logical processor. But this experiment proved that nature's messy. It spreads the computation around. It didn't follow his perfect, elegant rules. The world, it turned out, wasn't a theorem.
After that discovery, Pitts pretty much gave up. He became a recluse and drank heavily. He died alone in a boarding house in 1969, at just 46 years old. And then, only 4 months later, his friend and partner, Warren McCulloch, also passed away. Just a heartbreaking end to a partnership that had once promised to unlock the very secrets of consciousness.
But here's the incredible final twist to their story. Despite the tragedy of their own lives, their ideas ultimately won. That MP neuron is the direct ancestor of the deep neural networks that power literally everything today, from the AI in your phone to the web itself. The homeless teenager and the established professor, they founded a field that now dominates the 21st century.
Which really leaves us with this final thought. The story of Walter Pitts proves that the path to discovery is almost never a straight line of pure logic. It's all tangled up in friendship and loyalty, betrayal and despair. It really makes you wonder how much other progress has been lost, not because of a failed experiment, but because of a broken heart.